A man who electrified the modern world died alone in a single hotel room, so broke that his rent was quietly being paid by his former employer as a kind of charity, and within hours of his death, government agents were already going through his belongings. That part isn't legend. That part is documented fact. And once you understand what he actually spent his final decades chasing, the fictional version of this story stops feeling necessary, because the real one is strange enough on its own. Nikola Tesla died on January 7th, 1943, in room 33-27 of the New Yorker Hotel in Manhattan. He was 86 years old. He had not published significant new scientific work in years, and for a long stretch of his later life, he had been surviving on the goodwill of Westinghouse, the company that quietly covered his hotel bill long after his own money had run out. His body was discovered by a hotel maid who ignored a "Do Not Disturb" sign after it had hung on his door for 2 days, a small, quietly sad detail that appears consistently across biographical accounts of his final hours. Within hours of his death, agents from the U.S. Office of Alien Property arrived at the hotel and took control of his belongings, his notebooks, his personal correspondence, and a range of equipment and papers that took decades to sort through and, in some cases, were never fully cataloged for the public. That seizure genuinely happened. It is documented in FBI records, which have since been partially declassified and released under Freedom of Information Act requests, and has been written about extensively by historians. The reasoning given at the time centered on wartime concerns that Tesla, despite being a naturalized American citizen for decades, might have been sitting on research with military value, particularly anything connected to his decades-old claims about a defensive weapon capable of stopping enemy aircraft and armies at a distance, an idea he had publicly described in the 1930s under names including Teleforce, and which tabloids of the era eagerly nicknamed a death ray. Most of Tesla's recovered papers eventually made their way to what is now the Nikola Tesla Museum in Belgrade, Serbia, where they remain today, digitized and available to researchers. Some personal items were returned to his nephew, Sava Kosanovic, but the full accounting of exactly what the Office of Alien Property took, examined, and did with in those first days and weeks has never been completely and publicly resolved. And that genuine historical gap is part of why Tesla attracts so much speculative storytelling even 80 years later. You don't need to invent a secret machine in a Colorado basement to find something worth investigating here. The real archival uncertainty is already there in the documented record. To understand why Tesla's final years took the shape they did, it helps to understand who he actually was, separate from the popular image of a wild-haired man surrounded by artificial lightning bolts. Tesla was born in 1856 in the village of Smiljan, in what is now Croatia, then part of the Austrian Empire. By his own account and by the recollection of colleagues, he had an extraordinarily precise visual memory and the ability to run complex calculations and even visualize working machines mentally before ever building them. He emigrated to the United States in 1884 and briefly worked for Thomas Edison, a relationship that ended in a dispute over pay and credit that soured permanently and became the subject of one of the era's most consequential technical rivalries, the War of the Currents, fought over whether America's electrical grid would run on Edison's direct current or the alternating current system Tesla championed and helped develop through his work with George Westinghouse. Alternating current won that argument decisively, and it remains to this day the basic system delivering electricity to homes and businesses across the world. That alone represents one of the most consequential engineering contributions of the industrial age, entirely independent of anything that came later in Tesla's career. Tesla did not stop there, and this is where his story shifts from celebrated inventor to increasingly isolated visionary. By the early 1900s, he had become consumed by the idea of transmitting electrical power wirelessly across enormous distances, not through the air the way radio signals travel, but by treating the Earth itself as a conductor, pulsing electrical energy into the ground and drawing on the planet's own electrical properties to carry that energy anywhere. He believed this could eventually deliver both power and information to any point on Earth, without wires at all. The most visible expression of that ambition was Warden Cliff Tower, a roughly 187-foot transmission tower he built on Long Island beginning in 1901, backed initially by financier J.P. Morgan. Morgan's investment had been secured partly on the promise of a transatlantic wireless communication system, but as Tesla's ambitions expanded toward wireless power transmission on a global scale, and as Guglielmo Marconi successfully demonstrated transatlantic radio signaling using far simpler and cheaper technology, Morgan pulled his funding. Construction on Warden Cliff stopped in 1906, and the tower itself, unfinished and increasingly a financial liability, was ultimately demolished for scrap in 1917 to help settle Tesla's debts. Losing Warden Cliff is widely regarded by historians as the central turning point of Tesla's later life, the moment his most ambitious project collapsed publicly, and his financial and professional standing began an extended decline that never fully reversed. The site itself has its own quiet postscript worth knowing. The land sat largely forgotten for most of the 20th century, eventually becoming the property of a photographic film processing company, before a nonprofit group called the Tesla Science Center at Warden Cliff launched a public fundraising campaign in 2012, specifically to purchase and preserve the property. That campaign, boosted significantly by a viral crowdfunding push, successfully raised enough money to acquire the site, and it has since been developed into a museum and science education center dedicated to Tesla's work, finally giving Warden Cliff a second chapter, almost exactly a century after Morgan's withdrawn funding doomed the original project. Here's the part of Tesla's story that genuinely does connect to real, independently verified modern science without needing any embellishment at all. Tesla believed the Earth possessed natural electrical resonant frequencies, specific vibrational rates, at which the planet's own electromagnetic system could be tuned like an instrument, and he spent years in Colorado Springs, in 1899 and 1900, running high-voltage experiments, specifically trying to measure and exploit exactly that phenomenon. His contemporaries largely dismissed this as speculation bordering on fantasy. Then, in 1952, nearly a decade after Tesla's death, German physicist Winfried Otto Schumann published a paper describing precisely the kind of resonant phenomenon Tesla had theorized decades earlier, a natural electromagnetic resonance occurring inside the cavity formed between the Earth's surface and the ionosphere. Those frequencies are known today as Schumann resonances, with the primary resonance sitting at approximately 7.83 Hertz. They are entirely real, routinely measured, and used today in legitimate atmospheric and geophysical research, including some studies examining how these natural frequencies interact with the planet's weather systems, and even, in a few narrower research contexts, human physiology. Tesla never had access to the mathematical tools or measurement equipment Schumann eventually used, yet his own earlier calculations, based largely on direct experimental observation and theoretical reasoning, landed remarkably close to the same figure. That's a genuinely remarkable, well-documented historical fact. And it's exactly the kind of detail that makes Tesla's later work compelling without requiring any invented laboratory discovery layered on top of it. Tesla's later years were defined by increasing isolation rather than continued groundbreaking experimentation. He moved between New York hotels for decades, eventually settling at the New Yorker, and became known locally for an intense, well-documented devotion to feeding pigeons in nearby parks, a habit he wrote about with real emotional attachment in his own later correspondence, at one point describing a particular white pigeon he cared for as something akin to a close companion. He continued issuing occasional public statements about his research, including his death ray concept, and continued applying for patents into his later years, though the pace and impact of his output slowed dramatically compared to his most productive decades. Financial difficulty became a constant presence. He owed money to hotels repeatedly, moved when bills went unpaid, and relied increasingly on small support payments and occasional consulting work to get by. One of the more remarkable pieces of vindication in Tesla's story arrived only after his death, and it involves the invention most closely tied to his name in popular culture, radio. Guglielmo Marconi is credited in much of the public imagination as radio's inventor, and Marconi did win the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1909 for his contributions to wireless telegraphy. But Tesla had filed key patents years earlier covering fundamental radio technology, including patent number 645576, granted in 1897, describing core principles of wireless transmission that predated Marconi's own successful demonstrations. A long-running legal dispute over who actually held priority on the underlying inventions dragged on for decades, complicated further by the Marconi Company's considerable political and financial influence in the United States, including reported ties to U.S. Navy contracts that some historians argue made the government reluctant to rule against Marconi for years. In 1943, the same year Tesla died, the United States Supreme Court ruled in the case of Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company of America versus United States, upholding several of Tesla's earlier patents and effectively affirming that Tesla, not Marconi, held foundational priority on key radio technology. Some historians have noted the timing itself may not have been entirely coincidental, suggesting the government had its own practical interest in resolving outstanding patent royalty disputes tied to wartime radio production once Tesla was no longer alive to pursue further legal claims. Tesla did not live to see the ruling handed down, though it was decided in the same year he died. That timing alone is genuinely poignant without needing any additional embellishment, a legal vindication arriving just as the man it vindicated was disappearing from public life entirely. Tesla's list of real, documented contributions extends well beyond alternating current and radio patents. His early work laid groundwork later built upon in fluorescent and neon lighting, In early radio-controlled devices, including a remote-controlled boat he demonstrated at Madison Square Garden in 1898, that audiences at the time found almost impossible to believe wasn't controlled by some hidden trick, and in foundational concepts that later fed into radar technology. He held nearly 300 patents across multiple countries over the course of his career. That's an extraordinary, well-documented body of work by any measure, achieved by a man whose later decades were spent in genuine financial hardship and dwindling public relevance, chasing ideas that ranged from the scientifically prescient, like Earth's natural resonant frequency, to the commercially unworkable, like wireless power transmission, at a scale the physics and economics of the early 20th century simply couldn't support. It's worth being honest about why Warden Cliff and Tesla's wireless power ambitions never actually succeeded, because the real reasons are genuinely interesting rather than requiring any conspiracy to explain. Transmitting meaningful amounts of electrical power wirelessly across long distances runs into serious, well-understood physical limitations, since power delivered this way tends to spread out and weaken dramatically with distance unless very tightly focused. And focusing it well enough to be practical at a continental scale remained far beyond what early 20th century engineering could achieve, and in most conventional forms remains a serious engineering challenge even with modern technology. Tesla's financial backers, understandably, wanted a marketable product they could profit from, and a system explicitly designed to deliver electricity to anyone anywhere without meters, wires, or a way to charge for it was never going to attract sustained investment from businessmen expecting a return. That's not a hidden suppression campaign. That's the fairly mundane, well-documented reality of Gilded Age, venture financing, colliding with a genuinely radical and commercially unworkable idea. None of this means every mystery in Tesla's biography has been neatly resolved either, and it's worth being fair about where genuine documented uncertainty still exists, rather than pretending everything about his life is settled history. The full contents of what the Office of Alien Property seized in 1943 were not immediately or fully released to the public, and historians have spent decades since piecing together, through Freedom of Information Act requests and archival research, exactly what happened to specific papers and equipment in the weeks after Tesla's death. Some material has surfaced in Serbian archives decades after his death. Some remains genuinely unaccounted for in any complete public record. That real gap in the historical record is legitimately interesting on its own terms, and it's exactly the kind of loose thread that invites speculation, some of it responsible historical inquiry, and some of it the kind of embellished, fictionalized storytelling that invents secret machines and clandestine laboratory reactivations that never actually happened. The honest version of Tesla's story doesn't need a fictional Colorado laboratory or an invented device that violates basic thermodynamics to be worth telling. It already contains a man who fundamentally reshaped how electricity moves through the modern world, who correctly intuited a real, measurable planetary phenomenon decades before the instruments existed to properly confirm it, who was legally vindicated on his radio patents in the very same year he died alone and destitute, and whose personal papers still carry a genuine documented gap in the historical record that historians continue working to fill in. That's a remarkable enough story on its own terms. It doesn't need help from an invented resonance amplifier humming away in a basement that never existed to earn your attention. What actually happened to Tesla in his final years reads, in its own way, as a genuinely unsettling story about how brilliant, boundary-pushing ideas get treated by the systems around them, just not the version involving secret, suppressed machines. It's the more mundane, more familiar story of a man whose early work got adopted, commercialized, and built into the literal infrastructure of modern civilization, while his later, more radical ideas, some of them genuinely ahead of their time and some of them simply commercially and technically unworkable given the era he lived in, were left to wither for lack of funding, institutional patience, and a business model anyone could profit from. That's not a story about a hidden discovery waiting in a crate somewhere. It's a story about how an establishment decides which parts of a genius's work to keep and which parts to let fade, and it's arguably more worth sitting with precisely because there's no secret ending waiting to be uncovered. Tesla's real legacy is sitting in the walls of every building wired for alternating current, in every radio broadcast still legally traceable back to his original patents, and in a measurable, real vibration humming quietly in the space between the Earth's surface and its upper atmosphere, exactly where he said it would be, decades before anyone else could prove it.